it's what toughens us up, and that's what I don't think we have a tendency to
Man, that's a good line. You would think
raise
that slavery.
kids that way.
It's funny because I just got done. Martin Luther King Day was just yesterday, and I was listening to. Yeah, thank you for. I was going to tell you to pan your camera back. I was listening to people talking about like what do we do with the Negro after slavery, and they were arguing with Abraham Lincoln like, man, they're slaves and they don't have the grit to do this and they can't do that, and everybody was mad that people were having this argumentation because they were like, man, these are slaves who just got done building the wealth for America. What do you mean that they didn't have this? What do you mean they weren't tough? But biblically, like you just said, this is why we are opposed to slavery, though. This is part of the reason why we're against slavery, because it doesn't give you what freedom gives you, which is grit, tenacity. Go get. There's all kinds of different attitudes that come from freedom that you don't get in slavery, which is a problem if you're a human, because that's not what God has made you for, right? But
Right.
even God is looking at the children of Israel and like, man, my people, who he loves, needs some grit to them. And so what he does is gives them this polish, this grit through the wilderness.
Yeah, yeah. But you know what else actually strips you of that grit? Owning slaves.
Yeah, that it makes you weak
Yeah,
too.
yeah.
That's right.
Being a slave and owning slaves, it it has a way of degrading our own toughness.
It does
And
it does the same thing pornography does to a man.
yeah, right,
Right? Like
right.
you don't escape. Yeah, sure, you're abusing a woman, and sure you're getting what you want through that, but it's actually making you limp. It's not making you hard. It's making you soft. Doug
Right.
talks about cockles. Like that's what it does to. Like that's what it makes you the kind of guy who will let your woman be taken advantage of, and
Right.
slavery makes you the kind of person who doesn't understand the value of a human being. If you can't understand the value of a human being made in the image of God, and then how are you treating anybody else like a human being either?
Yeah.
You're broken all the way around. So it hurts both the slave and the owner to do that biblically, right? Like that's just
Yeah. So it's he- the and that's the thing is so often our response now to the issues of slavery has been like, well, the problem was that it was the white people that were in charge. We need to actually give now the black people the advantages that the white people had then. It was like, well, no, those weren't advantages. It's not an advantage to own people.
right.
It's actually, I mean, it's a financial advantage if you're a communist and you think everything is defined
But
by financial advantage.
that doesn't even last long in God's world, though.
No, it
It
doesn't.
doesn't.
That's because it's not real. It's not a real financial is not a real advantage, not a real long-term advantage,
No.
right? That because righteousness is a long-term advantage. Nobility is a long-term advantage.
Yeah, that's right.
Um, and
That's because you're talking
and
about covenantal at that point.
right, exactly, exactly, and that's what. Um, so when you've got people that are they want to restore, they say, "Oh, let's restore the South," or whatever. Um, that's it's not a good idea because the Undaunted Courage. I think it does a really good job of dealing with this. Stephen Ambrose's book on it's on Lewis and Clark, and it talks about the problems that you had amongst the gentry, the ruling class, the slave owning class, the lack of manliness that
Mm.
existed in the slave owning class. So you couldn't you couldn't find amongst the slave owning class the explorers necessary because they'd gone soft, right? And
Oh wow.
it's really interesting. And actually, Booker T. Washington's book,
Up from slavery.
Up from Slavery, he talks
Yeah,
about this as
he
well. Yeah,
does. Yep.
and it's really insightful that it's not good for society. It's a societal sin, but it's a emasculating sin for the owners of slaves, similar to pornography. Visiting prostitutes. Uh,
Yep.
that's an emasculating sin. It's a self-destructive. self-destroying, not self-destructive the way you're like, oh, you're going to get into drugs and it's going to be bad for you, but it's a selfhood undermining
Mm.
um, way of approaching the world, because you start thinking like somehow my desires are such that I should be able to coerce the world into conforming to them. And
It's a false form of dominion.
false form of dominion. The world doesn't work that way.
That's right.
Um, and that you, if you have coerced a woman with, $100, or I don't know how much prostitute costs. However much,
It's a
or if you,
pandemic. Things have changed. I
yeah,
have no
yeah.
idea either.
If you coerce a woman into your bed, you don't gain the advantages of a
Uh,
woman on your side, of a feminine perspective on your life and the troubles that you don't gain the strength of a woman
mm.
that way. But you get the illusion of it, right?
which
So
is which is the same thing as gay,
yeah,
right?
right,
Like it's
right,
fruitless. Ultimately, you can't do the thing that Adam needed to do with Eve in the garden to be able to take dominion and act like God
right.
when you haven't gone through the true process. That's good.
Yeah.
So
And
yeah, go ahead.
well, this is where, like, Geoffrey Chaucer, in the opening of the Canterbury Tales, he's got this amazing series of stanzas where he is talking about the sexual awakening of puberty, and how spring is kind of every year the world goes through puberty, creation goes through puberty, and
Mm,
there's a new sexual awakening, and how how that is actually also intended by God to be a religious awakening, be,
mm,
because beauty and fruitfulness are pulled together in creation, whereas sin wants to push beauty and fruitfulness apart, right? That somehow you can
mm,
have the beauty of a woman, or the beauty of creation, or the beauty of sexuality without fruitfulness. That you actually can't, right? That they're pulled together by God, and that creation teaches us that, right? That
mm,
that every year spring, the spring comes, the world gets wet, and everything starts having babies, right?
right.
The medievals were much more comfortable with sexual bodily images than the moderns are really, really prude. Post-Unitarian poetry is really prudish compared to medieval poetry.
What?
Um,
Why is that? You think we see
I think
we get uncomfortable with the kind of
was super uncomfortable with it. They were much more comfortable with
it.
it.
You know, if
Um,
can I take a stab at that real quick? Though? Is it
yeah,
because
yeah, go for it.
of our perversion? Do you? I mean, I don't think that we're more perverse, but we don't have. We only have. We don't have multiple categories for sexuality. You know, I've been reading "Sexual Suicide" by Glenn. Oh, he did Life After Google. Oh, I can't remember his name right now. Um,
I haven't
but
heard of this. It sounds good.
oh, it's a fabulous book.
Yeah,
It's a fabulous book. I'll think of his name in just a second. But one of the things that he is doing is having the conversation about the fact that a woman is a sexual being in ways that a man is not, multiple ways that a man is not. Matter of fact, her whole beginning of life already has told her that she's going to be the kind of being that nurses children. She's
right.
going to be the kind of being that uses her breast to nurse children. She's going to be the kind of being that her body is going to give birth. And it starts telling her that at a very young age that she is a different type of sexual being than a man. And a man, he kind of only really has one use for his sexual organ. Right. And it doesn't
Yeah,
do anything. It doesn't nurture. It just gets hard and then it plants seed. That's all it does.
yeah,
And so, but as I was my point is that as I was reading this book and listening to him talk, I was just grappling with how frank and forward he was being with the conversation and how uncomfortable I was being reading it. Right. It was,
yeah. Right.
and he's not dealing with, and I think it's kind of there's only one category for when we talk about this in the modern mind that it's perverse or it's private. There's the only two
Right.
categories. He's like, yes,
Yeah.
that's it. That's kind of, and because of that, I think because of the expansion of probably pornography and the feminist movement in the 40s and the sexual revolution. You say the sexual revolution didn't happen until the 2000s or something like that.
Yeah.
But the beginning of it,
the mid 90s.
mid 90s. Yeah. So
Yeah.
mid 90s. But we'll have to talk about that another time.
Yeah, another time.
But the idea that all of the sexual revolution supposedly that many people say happened in the 60s and the 70s, but really not until the 90s, that has created what we got to do is make everything sexually like that's prude. Like you don't talk about that. That's not public. It's not. We don't recognize it to the point that it's pushed in. Something else has taken its place with this new form of sexuality, right? Which is transgenderism, all this stuff like that. Something's going to fill that void because we've stopped having that conversation in the public, period. But I think that between the perversion of true biblical sexuality has created us. Well, we're just not going to deal with it at all. Yeah. So if we don't have any multiple categories for it. Well, this is the act, this is the being, this is the way the world works. Seed goes into the ground, it produces fruit. Like, sexuality is all everywhere in creation.
When I think, when we tried to basically move away from, well, okay. How far do we want to go back? Because I've thought about this one a lot, right? In spiritual terms, you have throughout the history of the church different ways of approaching knowledge of God, right? You've got what's called the way of affirmation and the way of denial, right? What is there that is not like God, right? And what is there that is like God? And that tension, you've got guys like, the church fathers are having this discussion, and some of them are saying, look, God is such a different sort of creature, different sort of thing than us, a different kind of being than us. Actually, it all comes to a head in Maximus the Confessor, who says God is no thing. It's not that God is nothing. He is not a thing. He is not an object, because you can't get apart from him and look at him as an object. Everything exists within him, within his being. Everything is dependent upon his being. And he establishes what's called the creator-creature divide. He establishes the vocabulary of it that is used the rest of church history, that God is not a being like us. We are dependent beings. He's independent beings. And so in Reformed parlance, this is the incommunicable attributes of God. And the way of denial in terms of the knowledge of God is that there isn't anything analogous to God. Right? Nothing is analogous to God in his being. Right? So any sort of knowledge of God is simply because God has communicated himself to us, because there's not a knowledge ladder to climb to get to him.
There's no, right?
Right? At the same time, God has created a world in which he reveals himself. Right? And so he is the way of affirmation is that everything is analogous to God because he's the creator of it and he designed it that way. Right? The world is this allegorical, symbolical knowledge of him. When we start denying the creator-creature divide, we start getting a knowledge. We start either falling into the way of affirmation without the way of denial, or into the way of denial without the way of affirmation. We can't hold them together unless you've got a God who is completely other and reveals himself across that
Oh my goodness, this is in my
divide.
head. I'm just jumping to the hypostatic union right here. Like
Right,
you know,
right,
like
right.
this is like, oh my goodness, he's fixed the problem.
So, right,
Okay.
and that's the thing is in the ancient world, you've always got this problem of the whoever's the most powerful is getting more and more godlike, right? Is becoming more and more godlike. And whoever's less powerful is less and less godlike. And so you have imperialism that runs rampant, that destroys people. You've got
Mm,
um, the Hinduism is an incredibly violent religion in its conception, where you've got the people at the top and the people at the bottom
mm.
don't view each other as the same kind of creature, and so a lot of you know worship by suicide, throughout Hinduism, right? In that we shine all that stuff up, but you read the stories of the first missionaries going into the Hindu areas, and they walk away like, oh my gosh, we've got to do something. These people are literally killing themselves in service of their idols. So we've got to stop this.
But what's
Um,
new?
right, right.
Yeah.
But Christians cared more about Hindus than
And
Hindus
just
did,
cared about
right?
him. Yeah.
Yeah, and so Christians were like, "Even if we don't convert them all, we want them alive." Right?
Right.
We'll get them in the next generation, we'll get them 3 generations down, and let's just stop the self-murder.
Yeah.
Um, but the, uh what happens is when Jesus comes, there's one place where the creature and the creator there's one point at which they come together, which removes every other thing that would have been that in the ancient world: the emperor, the philosopher, the guru, all these different places.
Prophet,
All of
priest,
those are
king,
removed.
right?
Yeah, right, exactly. All of those things are removed from that place, and Jesus takes over. Which is why when people say, "Oh, the Nicene Creed was written by Constantine to establish his power." Like, look, the Nicene Creed undid his power. Post Nicene Creed, you don't get empires that last, because the Nicene Creed makes it clear that there is no divine um, creature uh, point where the divine and the creature come together outside of Jesus. Right? So, and then in Jesus, we move into relationship with the divine, and the divine moves into relationship with the creation. But it's only in Jesus, right? So, and once you have when you move away from that hypostatic union, when you move away from the Nicene Creed, you end up with either some sort of animism where the way of denial goes away, um, or you end up with rationalism where the way of affirmation goes away. In the West, we went the rationalism route. The Unitarian movements. We'll just talk America. The Unitarian movements in early America, the rationalism, the 1800s was when we got uncomfortable with sexuality.
When you say rationalism, what do you mean?
That reason is the
And
only place where real knowledge can be had.
would that be like imperialistic thinking, where it's only what I can prove tangibly, physically, that I
Um,
can account for? But
no, rationalism is only things that can be logically affirmed in mathematical certainty can be counted as knowledge.
okay,
So, um, empiricism is only things that I can get to with my senses can be
uh,
counted as legitimate inputs for knowledge,
okay, okay,
right? Rationalism, and so empiricism and rationalism can fit together,
yeah,
uh, because you can count only the things that you're getting as inputs through your senses, and then but only count as real knowledge things that you have absolute mathematical certainty for.
okay,
So uh, we moved in that direction in the 1800s, And uh, knowing a woman is not that kind of knowledge, right? Solomon, he was the greatest scientist of his day. He was the greatest philosopher of his day. It says he knew all the birds and he knew the trees and he was doing experiments. It also says that he was interacting with all of the great philosophers, even um, even it tells us, I think Ethan the Edomite is mentioned. He could even interact with Ethan the Edomite, which I believe was sort of the Plato or the Aristotle of the
That
ancient
moment,
world,
yeah.
and that he was winning philosophical debates. He was incredibly rational. When it came time to talk about knowing a woman, he wrote a poem, right? Because it's a
Mm,
different kind of knowledge, right? He knew the limits of rational knowledge. He knew, but he also knew that you have to know a woman, right? He needed a queen to be able to rule well. That he knew that that um, that he knew and understood and could have um, on his side, right? He needed a helper um, to rule well. But that kind of knowledge is not rational knowledge. When rationalism comes in, we start getting really uncomfortable with sexuality. Um,
mm,
and so and chauvinism, the chauvinism of the late 1800s was really, really uncomfortable with sexuality, right? Um, it's really interesting, right? You read novels from the late 1800s, early 1900s about the 1800s, and the men get in ships and they're gone for months and months at a time. Right? They're more comfortable there
yeah.
than they are at home. Um, because knowing a woman is much harder than knowing how to sail a ship. And you
Well, that's facts.
know,
That's I
it's a
haven't
more
sailed the ship, but I can tell you that
right.
right now.
It's a more valuable knowledge, but it's much harder to gain.
Well, one of them, I mean, yeah. Well, it's the effect that they have in the world. Sure, ships move goods and get you places, but women make people. That's different,
Right,
right?
right.
That's a different kind of.
Yeah, eternal souls
Yeah, a ship
are
can't grow an ear. A ship can't grow fingers and a
yeah,
heart and all that kind of. When you were talking about puberty, one of the things that came to my mind, we were talking about this. We're going to talk about Dante. We're actually talking about Dante
yeah,
already. People
yeah.
don't even know it. But we were
I'm
we
gonna
were
grab my books.
yeah. Go ahead. How many? Oh, he can't hear me. It's like, well, how many books you got over there? Like, how many books did you just grab?
Only 3 this time.
Okay, so I'm gonna let you go through the books in a second. But I haven't read Dante. I don't know who Dante really is. I'm probably affected by him far more than I know, and don't even know how much I am affected by him. As I was talking to Neil earlier, we were talking about angels and demons and spirits and all that stuff that we have, even with hell. Dante is a huge part of our culture, and most of us don't even know it. But I was thinking, we are constantly, speaking of which, not knowing it, I've been in probably conversation with Dante, and I haven't ever known that I've been in conversation with Dante.
Right.
And part of the reason that I don't know that is because Dante wasn't covenantally handed down to me in parentally or educationally. I just didn't get any understanding of this. And so what I've noticed is in the conversations that we're having is that I've been bumping it like right now. Everybody's having a conversation with Marx and Gramsci, and we're having a conversation with socialists, and we don't even know that we're having conversations with them. And we don't know this, and the reason our kids are having conversations, we just didn't do a good job of covenantally passing down information at all. And so our kids and our grandkids and us, we're having conversations with people who didn't really die off in their world, but wickedness never really does. It gets suppressed more and more, but it doesn't die off. But if we get lax on it, the stuff comes back full fledged.
Right.
Like it's just like weeds. But I was thinking about the fact that, when I was growing up, I remember being like 8 or 9, my mom having a conversation with me about puberty, because I love working with my mom. I love protecting my mom, serving my mom, and helping her out. And she would say, "Man, David, you're such a good kid." I'm boosting my own horn right now. But she's like, "One day you're going to grow up and your body's going to act differently. You're going to get more testosterone in your system. You're going to want to be defiant. You're not going to want to listen to me. And here's the thing. You're going to want to give your desires to another woman. And I remember as a kid thinking,
like, no way.
Never, Mom. I would never do that. That is not me at all. And I remember her walking me through all the things that would happen during puberty. Your body's going to start changing. Your voice is going to start changing. You're going to see a girl and you're going to have desires for her and you're not going to know what to do with those things. You're going to act funny. She's like, you're going to see a pretty woman and a girl and you're going to be acting nervous and you start sweating and you're going to, what's going on with me? I've never had this. And she walked me through all of these details of how I was going to change and be a different kind of person as I matured. And I remember the moment that I could see those things happening. I remember when I hit puberty and I remember saying to myself, my mom told me about this.
Right.
My mom said this was going to happen and I didn't think it was going to happen. And so I was able to take a full calculation of myself and going through puberty, fighting against my own sin to be able to want to be my own person and leave from some of those things weren't sinful. There was other ways in which I wanted to do it that was sinful. And because of her telling me about what was coming, even though I had no idea it was actually going to happen, when it came to be, I was able to engage it with clear accuracy and to fight against it. And it saved me so many problems that I would have had. I went and worked harder. I wanted to build the castle for my queen. She gave me, like, this energies and these focuses that you have as you're maturing are for the purpose of work. Throw it into your work, build something so that you can welcome a queen into your castle. And I remember her like, these are the conversations my dad should have had with me. Right. And she could have had other conversations with me about women. But, nevertheless, when I hit puberty, when I hit that time of rebellion, when I hit what the people called the teenage years, I was ready to fight as a Christian, my own rebellion against my mom. And now I bring all that up to say, the more that my mom was telling me and communicating to me biblically, my sin that I was going to have to deal with in the future of my maturity that I was going to have to deal with, I was better able to actually deal with it and win battles that most of my friends could not win.
Right.
And
because you knew what story you were in.
She told me exactly.
You were ready to know what character to play.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And what I feel like now is I feel like there's some stories I ain't been told. There's some people and some situations that I'm looking at like, this is new for me. I ain't, what does this one do?
Right.
I'm back in school again. And I think everybody, I'm not the only person who's feeling like that. I'm watching everybody. What is this critical race theory? It was so funny when I was telling you about kind of critical race theory and what it's doing. You were like, oh, this is just Gnosticism.
Yeah. Where it's like, oh yeah, I haven't heard of critical race theory, but I've heard of this. This is a new name for an old, an old dragon head that pops up every once in a while.
And that's my point, Jason, is that what I want to do with what we're doing is to try and give people some of the stories that we haven't been able to have for whatever reasons, covenantal breakdowns, the lack of engaging. I wrote down some of the things that I just want to tell people kind of some of the things we want to do with just talking to Foucault, in conversations with Foucault, in conversations with Aquinas, Chesterton, in conversations, because we're having, again, these conversations have happened already in the past. These aren't new conversations. They're just new to us because we haven't been trained well. We haven't had the education that we need. And we've had a lot of covenantal breakdown in the family that great grandma ain't telling the stories about Hitler and Stalin, and for instance, Sharon's grandmother, she was born right after the time of the of Hitler. So there's a whole culture of her growing up, being at a time where black people didn't have the rights to vote. What was that like? The world that was going on, the stories that were happening. There's so much in our history, in recent history, that we don't have, let alone, biblical history that
our people's history, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so,
because there's family history I got to hang out with my mom some this morning, which is fun because get to hear stories, and she
Yeah.
was telling me, and there's a sculpture that I keep in my office. Let me grab it.
Family heirlooms.
Of uh,
What is that?
it's a Bob Scrivener sculpture. It's a bronze sculpture. It's Captain Lewis and Our Dog, and so it's a Lewis and Clark
Oh yeah,
sculpture.
yeah.
There's a full size version of this in the Capitol. So I'm the descendant of the first governor of Montana. So there's a full size
Oh wow.
version of this sculpture, and it's actually 3 sculptures. And so we have the small versions. My grandma and grandfather were given the small versions that were then used to make the full size versions at the Capitol. And it was split up between my grandpa and grandma's 3 kids. Each got one of them, and so I keep it here in my office.
That's nice, man.
She was in here, and she was telling me the story, telling me some stories about my grandma and grandpa because of the sculpture. She's like, "Oh yeah, that's. Let me tell you how that came about." And it was, and so there's this family history, right, where I can go to Montana and get my picture taken with the giant sculpture that is of my descendant, right? So I've got this family history here, that is important, but because I'm a Christian, all of that family history of mine is also your family history, right? Like
Right.
this is all this is our story together. Um, and then uh, and then all of the stories of all of the Christians going back is all our family history, right? And
Right.
we have a tendency to think of history as a sort of that it's the dull part of school where
Right.
you get rather than with the dates and everything, rather than thinking like, oh, this is my family history, right? So when you read about Dante, it I have heard Dante called, oh, he's that he's one of those dead white men that's trying to continue to control our culture, right, with his white supremacy and like what. But that is how we're told to define the human race now. So rather than
Mm.
saying like, oh look, I've got this family connection, covenantally speaking, with this Italian poet, right? Um, same, one of my other favorite poets, James Weldon Johnson, was a African American poet in the early part of the 1900s. But I have the same connection with him as I do with this Italian poet. It's
Mm.
a family connection. It's a covenantal connection. Even though I share probably the same amount of blood and DNA with both of them, that's not we're not materialists. So the connection we have is not is covenantal, legal, familial. Right? It's not physical DNA. That's not how we define people or story or history.
No, that was part of the problem that the Jews had,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Yeah,
uh, that's
they, that
unclean, Lord. Now, when
they yeah, they wanted that. They wanted that to be the connection, right?
yeah,
They wanted race DNA. They wouldn't have thought of it as DNA, but
no,
that's the argument they're making, right? They wanted that to be the connection. And Jesus was like, I got a sword for that connection. Yeah. And I came to kill that.
right,
Right. He said, I've got a sword for the family. Right. But it's not
mm,
because it's because he was reestablishing the family on its proper grounds. Um, even in the garden, the connection was not a DNA connection. It was a covenantal
that's right,
connection.
that's right.
So, um, yeah, and that's why I think getting into conversation with people of the past is really what we need right now.
Well,
You know, because people are like, "Oh, we've got this growing socialism in our country. We've got growing," um, and we think, "I've got to figure out how to fight socialism," but we never say, "Have we had this fight before? And did we
right.
win or did we lose?"
Yep.
Right? And the reality is, we had Machiavelli, right? We had a fight with Machiavelli all the way back into the right in the middle of the Middle Ages. These ideas have come up before and Machiavelli was an influential philosopher on a lot of the people establishing socialism, establishing communism, but
Before it even
he had
have
been
those names,
he
right?
he had been defeated, right?
Mm.
His books remained around so that we would never forget, "Hey, look out for these ideas." But, he had been defeated before, there was a really popular book, um, that I'm trying to remember what was the name of it. I there was a really popular book that was quoted often in English pulpits, he shortly after the Reformation. It was written in Geneva in 1576, Discourses Against Machiavelli, right? And the author was a lawyer named Innocent Gentilet, and it was sermons on the means of governing. So Machiavelli was used really often as a way of saying that, look, that's the wrong way to govern. Let me explain the biblical way that we're supposed to govern. Machiavelli was a materialist, right? His metaphysic was that there is only matter, and whoever has the power to manipulate matter. Nothing has a nature. Nothing has
Mm.
an intended way use. There is power and there is matter, and you either have the power or you don't. If you have enough power, then you can manipulate the matter into whatever you want it to be
Wow,
because it doesn't have an answer.
That's
Yeah,
God stuff.
you can be God. But what's amazing is that's the trans
Mhm.
philosophy, right? You can overcome your current physical um, setting if you have enough power.
Well,
And
because you don't have any form, like, you don't have any, what did you call it? Um,
any nature or
any
in
nature. There's no
any
nature.
intended form, yeah. So, and Machiavelli said, "Where is that power? Centralized government." Right.
Mm.
If you can get enough power into centralized government, then um, then you have a then you can overcome the nature of anything and
So
make it
he
what you want.
he's putting the God at government, and whoever controls the government controls the God.
Yep.
That
Yeah, exactly.
that sounds
And
like our current situation. Actually,
right,
that's
100%,
where
right? So
everybody
this
runs to.
and conservatives say, and the problem is that they're in charge and not us,
That's
right?
the only
Rather than
difference.
saying, no, the problem is actually this fundamental metaphysical error that we think that the government can do any of that, right? That we think that
Mm.
that we if we gather enough power, um, then the government can do any of those things, but it can't. Machiavelli was rejecting Dante. He was rejecting he was saying that Dante's vision of the world needs to be set aside, buried, destroyed, or I will never be able to accomplish my goals.
Mm.
And so what we should do is say,
What was
what
Dante?
is it about Dante
That
that was
yeah.
such a threat to absolute political power that that you um that's my way of working backwards into the importance of Dante for the present.
Yeah.
I actually believe that Dante's vision for the world um is the thing that the church needs to be inculcating into ourselves, into our kids, into our understanding of the church and the families that uh, so that um, we can then be a blessing and rescue the world from the kind of power mongering um, socialism that right now we have the same metaphysical assumptions about things. And so we're not really of any use, even if we get in charge. Right?
Because
Yeah.
we've talked
So
about that. Everybody's a
yeah,
Gnostic right now. Everybody
right,
has
right,
broken metaphysics right now. So we have to be baptized.
right. Because when Machiavelli says with enough centralized power we can manipulate reality into whatever it is we want it to be, right? That's what he says. That he, he,
That's
when
insane. That's the same argument. I mean, sorry, Jason, but that's the
no
same
no
argument that we get from the climate change people, as if we can fix it. And this is why I always go back to Hosea 4. It's like, why is it that your fish are dying and your bird and the fowl and the beast are all collapsing? It's not because you can fix it. It's because you won't repent.
right,
Right.
right, exactly.
Do you understand that? It's not like, oh, if we can all come together under government and pass laws about green climate change, all of a sudden we're going to create. It's the same exact sort of thing that we can, because of government, we can save the planet.
Right.
Right?
That we can actually somehow gain control over reality, right?
Yes.
That and not just like we can change the weather, but we can actually manipulate reality into what it is that we want. I mean,
Yes.
I think it's I think the whole argument about climate change is a problem just reveals the fact that but everybody knows the climate has been shifting and changing, but for
Right.
some reason we think the one we've got right now we need to keep, right? Right. This is the right one. We have landed on the right climate, and now it can't change,
Well, in a
right?
postmodern world, it's amazing that they would even know what right is. What
Right.
is
Well, that's
right?
the thing. It's revealing. But here's, I mean, progressivism is the most conservative philosophy you will ever. They never
Mm,
want anything to change. it's
wow.
it's it's you go to like Boulder, Colorado, Santa Cruz, California, these ultra progressive places, and um, and then try to put up a new billboard and see what happens. They're like, no, nothing can ever change. Right? Things have to stay exactly the
That's
way they are right
funny.
now. Right? And that's all that climate change is. This is sentimentalism. I like the climate the way it is right now, and I don't want it to ever change. So we've got to do everything we can to keep it from changing. Well, that's just
So
sentimentalism,
then
right?
what's the difference?
Maybe there is a better climate, and we're not there yet. Who knows?
Who that Well, at that point, though, it makes me think like, is there really
That
any difference between Republican or conservatives at that point
no,
and liberals? Like that's scary because when you think about it like that, they share the same thing. Like, the only thing they want is the power between.
right. It's a disagreement about who should have power, not a disagreement about the nature of power, the nature of reality, the nature of
They're
government.
all going the
And
same way.
then they're all going the same way, the nature of humanity. And
Wow.
it's frustrating because, you know, people people are always wanting you to choose sides. We're like, well, look, this side's driving at a little bit of a lower rate of speed towards the cliff, so that might give us some more time to to
I want to get out of
to
the car.
to get out of the car, or we can jump from here and it's gonna hurt less, but, I mean,
So
we're not of any use, when we actually get power because we don't because we have agreed with all of the Machiavellian assumptions
wow.
in the first place.
So okay. So who are we? Are we in conversation with Machiavelli? Or are we in conversation with Dante?
I wanna get into a conversation with Dante because I think that's the way out of Machiavelli.
So
We
we're
right
actually
now
in a conversation with
we
Machiavelli, but
right yeah, right now we've just jumped into Machiavelli's car, and we're like, "Go ahead and drive us wherever you want," and then we're like, "Well, maybe we should sit in the front seat rather than them," and then uh, we're not trying to switch cars.
Tupac was
Um,
right.
Tu Tupac was always right. That's the thing you got to.
Doggone. So
But
then, go ahead.
Tupac was aware of it, actually. I mean, because
Yeah.
Tupac was completely aware that he was living in a Machiavellian world. And
Yep.
when we were talking about this a minute ago, where was it this morning or yesterday when we were talking about Malcolm X,
Yeah.
right? That that um, I almost tweeted something about it, and then I realized it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. It's the wrong day to
Did you?
come out in favor of Malcolm X. As a big furry white guy to be like, actually,
You just need to
uh,
you just need to identify
yeah,
as
yeah. Actually, I'm a supporter of Malcolm X. He said, not realizing it was Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday.
timing.
Yeah, timing. That's why I don't tweet at all. But um, he when you've got the Black Power movement, there were some things looking in the wrong direction and misapplying power, but Malcolm X, he's trying to say we don't need the government's permission,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's
Yep.
actually resisting a Machiavellian world that says we need the government to fix this for us. He's like, no, we don't. We've got each other. We've got our community. We've got our neighborhood. We've got our families. Let's build something. Let's shop at one another's businesses. Let's build up a community in which we know and support one another, and we don't need the government to back us up. Let's build our own hospital. Let's
Right.
start our own shops, start our own clothing companies. Right? That is actually a an attempt to undermine the Machiavellian world, which makes sense why you've got to assassinate that guy,
Mm.
right? Um, when somebody says, "Hey, there's a way out of this power dynamic," um, and there's this whole other kind of power that is not government power, right? That there is a power that exists that's not government power. The government says, "Nope, we got to kill that. We got to kill
Mm.
that. If he gets any sort of traction, we got to kill that guy." Right, and because it's a threat to the system itself to acknowledge that there's power outside of that centralized government power, because what Machiavelli says is you've got to centralize all the power in the government, then it can control reality, right? If there's power outside of it, that's trying to exist on its own, unless you suck that power in,
Yeah. And
right?
and
Which
and
is why the Juneteenth things that makes me so mad.
this is hilarious for me watching you go through this. I'm just sitting here dying. I just want to say too, though, Malcolm messed with everybody's power structure. It wasn't just the
Right.
government that wanted to kill him,
No,
because
yeah.
he started messing with Nation of Islam's power structure too. Like, he starts messing with all that. So he had all kinds of people who wasn't happy with him because he just didn't feel like he needed, certain structures and orders in order to be able to create a certain type of culture and environment. But what were you saying
Right.
about Juneteenth?
So, well, one last comment, because Malcolm X understood that he had been created with the power to take dominion of whatever
Mm.
was put in front of him, right? I can get hold of that and I can transform it, right? I don't need anybody's
Mm.
permission to be a human being. That's a threat to the people trying to say, no, we're the ones that gave you human being permissions. So no, the Juneteenth thing, I know I bring this all, it makes me so mad that the federal government made Juneteenth a holiday, when as if we need their, like, as if black folks need their permission to celebrate this holiday that they've been celebrating, and then all of a sudden the government's like, you know what, you guys can have my permission to take the day off now, right?
Right.
Like, well, you're not a slave master. That's the whole point of the holiday. Is the and you know Joe Biden announcing it like he's giving something. Like,
Give you
so
guys a
I'm like,
date now.
"I'm giving you guys Juneteenth as a holiday."
That
Like, that's not how holidays work, you rat bastard.
you
Like,
upset it out. What's so funny is seeing Jason upset about Juneteenth. Getting the government doesn't give you this day. What are you
yeah,
doing?
that's not how holidays work. You just that's not
But
especially I mean, of all the holidays, this one, um,
especially
and it's not
exactly.
you're right, it's I mean, I get it's not my holiday, and not so that it
No, it's yours too. Yeah, remember
but
we talking
I
about this
mean, it is
covenantal family
right,
thing. It's
covenantal family thing, it is, but it's it's a power grab to try and take control back from
mm,
and there's been this long process of trying to, so the federal government, because of eugenical and racist philosophies and people, they put a lot of energy into pushing black folks out of the society, out of the
right.
center. They went off and created their own thing, and now the government wants it back.
And you know what? And
Like,
they don't even know that that's what's happening right now. That's what makes me
right,
so upset. It's like, yeah,
right. It's like, what you don't get to now claim all that. You don't get to say like, oh look what we have now established Juneteenth as a federal holiday. You're welcome.
yeah,
Like, I couldn't, and it made me. I didn't understand how so many folks could say like, "Hooray! The
right.
federal government gave us a holiday." What are you talking about? Juneteenth is the celebration of your freedom from.
Jason's running him around to all the black people. Don't let them take it from you. Fight the power. Fight the.
Yeah, totally. I was, I mean, I was, I was livid
I remember that
yeah,
because I was too. We were both sharing that moment. I was like, hold on a second. We didn't
like,
ask for your permission.
we don't need permission to take a holiday. That's the whole point of being free people,
So
right?
okay, so
You don't need permission to
to
take a
take
holiday.
holiday, um, so take this back to that is moving back into a Machiavelli
Right, right.
culture and
It's a
attitude.
it's a Machiavellian move by the government to say, "We can't have you over there celebrating without our permission. We're the ones that give permission. We're the ones that give holidays. You can't go off claiming to have a holiday that we didn't give you." Or that's a Machiavellian move that says we've got to centralize the power, right? Because celebration is one of the most powerful things that human beings do to to
Mm.
embrace the reality as God gave it, right? That is, we especially celebrating a historical event, um, to memorialize in celebration
Oh,
a
that's
historical
good.
event.
Which is why
that's a
the fight
that's
for
a
Christmas, the fight for
right,
Easter,
right.
all those things are.
All those things are really important, because you're saying, and it's why Charles Dickens' novel, uh, about Scrooge continues to be so important, right? Or to be so powerful to people. Because you've got this, one of the we're historical beings. When something happens in history, we memorialize it by saying thank you on the calendar. That's a way of
Mm.
being human, um, and having a historical nature that can't be manipulated, right? I have a reality as a human being that exists whether anybody acknowledges it or not. Whether the government doesn't give it to me, that there's nobody that gives that to me outside of God, right? That I have that existence, metaphysically. The government wants, in a Machiavellian situation, the government is the one that defines reality, right? Whoever has the power is the one that defines reality. And so, when a government sees a people self defining, sees a people saying,
Ooh.
I exist without your permission. I I am human without your permission, right? All of that. Um, and then the government is going to try and in a Machiavellian setting, the government is going to try and take that back, right,
That
and reclaim it.
that's
And
good.
that's what the federal declaration of Juneteenth was. It was a, hey, we can't have you off the plantation. This pisses me off. Like, hey, we need come back over to the plantation, right? If like, and there,
This is where Malcolm X, if he was here, he would have cursed them out.
oh yeah,
Right? Like that's
right,
I mean, I'm not in one sense I'm like not a fan of Malcolm X, in the other sense
yeah,
part of it I'm like I'm a fan because I know I
right,
know that even though he is jaded and missing some of the total of the vision, he is understanding enough of the structures and the systems to say, wait a second, that leads me back to slavery.
right.
Right?
That and that and I we're he had a clear understanding that we were that you needed to refuse to move back in that direction, right?
Yep,
Even
yep.
small steps back in that direction. He said, "No, no, we don't go that way. We move towards greater flourishing, greater freedom, right? And that begins with not needing your permission, right? Slaves need
Mm,
permission. We're not slaves. We don't need your permission. That,
man.
that that's and that's what I love about him. Now, not not everything was perfect, but
No.
we don't need people to be perfect to be people that we emulate.
Honestly, we should look at Malcolm X in a lot of ways that we look at some of the Western heroes that we have that
Mhm.
have been phenomenal in a lot of ways.
Right.
In other areas, they just weren't that good.
Yeah.
And we can speak
100%.
honestly about that. I don't know why we can't hold those two things together. This is not. Look. Everybody is a mixed bag.
Yeah.
So I don't
Right.
have a problem with that. I want to get to though, like I want to understand what is it that Dante has presented in such a way that Machiavelli felt like he had to destroy.
Yeah.
What is Dante bringing to the
So
conversation?
so Dante brings a vision of reality, that reality is a a living allegory that has an independent existence from myself, right? That I am a part of this living allegory that has it's independent of me while being fully dependent upon God, right?
Mm,
So, um, whether I uh, whether I control it or not is not actually the question. It's but the whole thing is so it's not the world is not this is the power dynamic in the world is God and creation, not me, right? That it's not a question of who gets to be in charge because they get to define reality. Reality exists because of what God says it is, right? So that's the first part is that it has uh, a metaphysical nature given to it by God. Our
mm,
job is to discover, enjoy, and um, discover, enjoy, and use properly whatever it is that we find as it exists the way God says it does, right? So when we, if excuse me, when we see a hammer, our job is to say, "Ooh, what's that hammer? Um, what's it for?" Learn how to use it properly, enjoy it, and then use it properly to serve our neighbor, to serve the
mm,
Lord. And that's a way of embracing our own humanity. Um, and then all of those things about creation reveal to us who God is and become points of fellowship with Him.
mm.
Right. When we use creation properly, it becomes a point of fellowship with God. Um, Now, a lot of this revolves around two things: the city of Florence, right? He loved his city. He loved um, being Florentine, and and then Beatrice, this woman he met when he was a little boy, and she was a little bit older, but still a little girl who he fell madly in love with. and she ends up dying young, and he remains madly in love with her throughout his life. Um, and which is something that I think we think of as a strange thing. He's a 9-year-old boy, falls in love. Believe she was 13 when they met. So she's a little bit older. And he says, it was the first time I realized that I was running into a creature that I could not come up with. I could not have invented out of my imagination
Mm.
the glory of this creature that stood in front of me. She's a 13-year-old girl. And he goes home and he writes his first sonnet. He's just like 9 years old. And
Boy,
it's
9-year-old
not
were different back then, wasn't it?
right.
I ain't gonna
Well,
lie. I was about 8 or 9 when I saw Sharon in Sunday school. And I was like,
right.
hey, Miss Pretty.
I mean, no, there's something about that age, right? He new to puberty, that first vision of a beauty that you need to experience in a new way, but you don't know what it is.
Yeah.
You that you can't consume it, you can't acquire it. You don't. It's not like a butterfly that you want to pin to a wall and then it just sits up there. You don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
It's a beauty and so he experiences this, and then he writes a sonnet, which he says was a bad sonnet because he was young, but
she made something come out of him.
But like,
have to write.
There was an awakening.
Yeah.
That had to do with puberty, had to do with his bodily response to her, but it also there was something in his soul that jumped, right? And he didn't understand it.
Sparked.
As he got sparked something, right? As he got older, he actually tries to pursue her, and she turns him down, right? And he says he goes home and he cries because she wouldn't shake his hand back, right? Talking like 11-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy, who he's gotten it in his mind. This time he's going to go up and he's going to offer to shake her hand. And she's like, no, you weirdo. Right? And he goes home and he sobs. Right. I love the Italian poets in the Middle Ages. They're super emotional. And Petrarch is one of my favorites. And, he used to carry this little tiny version of Augustine's Confessions over his heart. And he would hike up to the top of mountains and read portions of it and sob, and they're so emotional. It's hilarious because I'm Scottish and I'm like, I don't get that. But it's something. But there's something good about it that I just don't experience,
right?
And they do. But through their poetry, I can co-experience things with them. But so she won't shake his hand. It devastates him, but it causes him to think, well, what is it that she actually wants, and begin to try to get to know her. And as he does, what he realizes is he's not virtuous enough, right? He looks at her, she looks at him and sees a kid that doesn't want God, that doesn't want what's right, that is self-centered and not centered on Christ. And so he begins to try and grow in his sanctity and understand theology, and he begins reading the Bible, or going to hear the Bible read, and to learn theology and learn what it is that God wants, and begins to want it himself because she wants it for him, and she's beautiful, right? And then she dies young. He ends up, and you have this, he ends up dedicating his poetry to her, and then writing this long extended poem and of the Divine Comedy, which is a 3-part kind of fantastical epic poem where he is given a tour through hell, and then given a tour through purgatory, and then given a tour through paradise. It's this walking tour, and his first guide is Virgil. Virgil is the ancient pagan poet of the Italian peninsula, that opened Dante's eyes to the beauty of poetry and the beauty of his own homeland, and Florentine in particular, Florence, but just the Italian peninsula, the Mediterranean, and so he because of Virgil, he loves being Italian hasn't really been invented, but he loves being Florentine. He loves speaking Italian. He loves all of that. And so he gets this tour from Virgil through hell and purgatory, and then Beatrice takes over and gives him a tour of paradise.
Mm.
Beatrice is long dead at this point.
Yeah.
So he gets to paradise. She's there. He imaginatively walks him through the paradise. And as he grows, he comes to understand that God sending Beatrice into his life was actually God sending him a window through which he invited Dante to himself. The beauty of Beatrice was an invitation to spend eternity with Jesus, who is even more beautiful. Beatrice was the stream that Dante swam up to find the source of beauty. In his imagination, because he never married her, or she was not his wife, but his young love, his first crush, was actually an invitation from Jesus to RSVP to eternal pleasure, because seeing her was so pleasurable, right? That little pleasure was an invitation to the ultimate pleasure, and that all beauty, all pleasure, all was all an invitation to ultimate pleasure, because every beauty was a stream through which you could swim up to the source of ultimate beauty, which is Jesus. That understanding of the world undercuts it undercuts the need to manipulate reality, because actually you want to embrace reality if that's the truth, because in the embrace and the enjoyment of a thing in and of itself as an enjoyable thing that God has given, you're actually using it properly, and it's leading you towards Jesus. So the world becomes a table that has been laid out, and everything in it is an opportunity to have fellowship with God, right? And all you have to do is use it properly, right? Embrace the world as you find it and use it properly. So it completely shifts there's a number of things that do this, but it's one of the things that shifts the understanding of women in society, right? You move from loving a woman after Dante, and after so Patrick and one of the young nuns in his church, didn't have what it came to be understood as until much later, was a young woman named Brigid, and she had a similar effect that Beatrice has on the Italian people. Brigid has a similar effect on the English speaking people. Our word bride comes from the name Brigid, and she never married, but she was this woman who was known for her wisdom, known for her hospitality, known for her beer. Or she made
that's a good woman right there, boy.
Yeah. So people would come from all over to sit at Bridget's table and hear and ask her questions, and take her up on her hospitality. Kings would come to get wisdom from her, and she wrote a beautiful poem called "I Wish the Lord Would Give Me a Lake of Beer." Right. And because she said, I want to host the whole world. I want to host the angels. I want to be able to show hospitality to the amazing creatures that God has created in the men and women of the world. And so people began to say in English, I wish I could find my Brigid. And she became the ideal woman. She was wise, hospitable, beautiful, and when you experienced her love, it was as if you were getting a hug from God himself, right? That kind of,
Mm,
and then that word becomes bride. I'm looking for my Bridget becomes I'm looking for my bride. And now when we get married, we say, this is my bride. Um,
mm,
so Beatrice has has a similar effect on the imagination of the continent, that she was beautiful. She loved, um, she loved virtue. To love her was to become more virtuous because that's what she wanted,
mm,
right? She wanted you to become more like Christ. And so that was the only kind of love that she asked for. You become more who God created you to be. That's what it looks like to love me, right? Um, so and it caused Dante to grow up, to mature. This vision was he looked back and said, my first crush was actually a spiritual experience. I just didn't recognize it at the time.
mhm.
Right? It was an invitation from Jesus to understand what beauty was. And Chaucer's writing in England, the next generation, and he's the first one to bring Dante to the English continent, right? He's out, working. Um, he's being sent as an ambassador, and he discovers Dante. He brings Dante back to England, and introduces Dante, and he writes something similar about beauty, the awakening of puberty being a spiritual awakening or a spiritual opportunity to come to understand what it is that God is communicating through the beauty of nature, through the beauty of sexuality, through the beauty of a woman, through the beauty of a man, or the handsomeness is how we would put it, but they make the same sort of distinction. But the handsomeness of a man, was an invitation to women. Um, Medieval women were much more comfortable with their sexuality than modern women.
In what way? What do you mean by that? Like,
Um, they they understood that that the joy of sexuality, the joy of, you know, the way bodies fit together was a part of the fun of fruitfulness, right?
mm,
That um, in fact, it's really interesting to read medieval writers because, um, women are more interested in sex than men in the medieval imagination. Um, we the you watch our TV shows like The Big Bang Theory. Um, it starts out by saying, the whole universe was in a cold. Uh, the opening move song is something like the whole universe was in a cold, dark state, right? And then the Big Bang happened,
yeah.
and it's this purposefully, and the characters are these scientist men who are all materialists. Um, and so they're and it makes them girl crazy in the, not even girl crazy, they're just the Big Bang Theory, um as a scientific creation theory, or where the myth of where the universe came from leads to a bunch of men who are just after orgasm, right? The Big
Right,
Bang
right.
Theory is like it's a double entendre in the title.
You know what? I never knew that, and I almost feel like I could have lived without ever knowing that. But
But
yeah, it
you
makes
look at
sense.
the storytelling, that was the most popular show for years on television,
Yep.
and it's about a bunch of guys who are basically trying to not be rapists, even though their philosophy allows them to be. And they're always it's really weird, and they just try to make it funny. It actually is really funny. It's a well-written show in terms of the comedy writing, and it can be really hilarious at times, but they're slipping their philosophy past the Watchful Dragons with
Uh-huh.
humor. Um,
That's right.
yeah, because it's it's a it's the philosophy of a rapist. the Big Bang Theory is the philosophy of a rapist. It really just comes down to the pressure and the power of the moment as to who's in charge, and they get to define reality.
You know,
That
I wanna go back for a second. You know, I've got a teenage girl now. She's 14. My son is 2 years behind her, and so she'll be 15 this year. My son's going to be 13 this year, and I need to take what Dante understood about this next phase of sexuality that they're about to go through and start explaining to them that story.
right. Yeah.
That story, because what we do with puberty is we do two different things. We one of them, we say, hey, this is good, don't touch it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And
Or the sex is dirty, bad, and
or it's
nasty.
really, or
So
hey,
save it for the one you really love.
right,
Right.
exactly. We do those two things instead of saying there's going to be a moment that you are going to understand just how amazing God is.
Right.
And he's going to reveal that moment to you in the beauty of a woman, or in the heroics of a man, you know, and you're going to be attracted to that. That is beautiful. That is
Yeah.
good. But you need to understand what is actually happening.
Right. You're about Jesus is about to send you a really crazy invitation.
Right.
And
Right.
let me help you understand how to RSVP to Jesus with this invitation, because it's going to be so amazing
Yeah.
that you're going to want to take that invitation and treat it as if it's the real thing.
Right.
N- right.
Exactly.
N-
Right.
Now, we're talking about a person, right? That the invitation to a greater relationship with Jesus comes through this person, and the way that it's a matter of treating that person the way you should. That's how you RSVP to the greater
Mm.
banquet, to the greater banquet.
And so then, you know, because so then what happens is that when that here, there's a couple of things I was thinking about. You know, every time I watch a movie with my kids, I always am trying to find, there's certain, in good movies and good storytelling, no matter what it is, I don't care what it is. When you're watching, you can almost always find a moment of baptism
Mm-hmm.
where that person, they were acting a certain way, they were converted, transformed, see things different. You can always see it as either rain or they actually go into the water. Usually it's water or rain, and somehow, and sometimes it's not always that way, but there's a moment where they transform, they turn and they see things clearer than they did before, and they're able to. It was in Miles Morales, you know,
Yep.
with his dad there talking with him, and he
That
had
movie's
that
so
moment.
brilliant.
Brilliant film. It was in Encanto. It was in, you know, no matter what, it's always water, it's always baptism. I've taught my kids in one way or another to look for baptism in stories, because even the world can't help but tell stories with baptism in it. But even in this might be a way for me to help them say there's a baptism that's going to happen to you in this, where
Mm-hmm.
there's a part of you that's going to come alive that wasn't alive before. And that coming alive will allow you to live in a whole new way for the rest of your life past that. And I was wondering if it's okay, you know, could you think of that in the same way? Can you think of this moment, this turning? Because we talk about with puberty, and I get what, but I want to be able to be more poetic with this than just, oh, your body's changing. You know, I want them to see this grander than your voice is getting deeper. You know, for me, my mom was trying to tell me that my desires would be more and affect me greater and have impact on the world beyond where I currently was at, and my alliances would rearrange. You know, she made it so that the world around me would shift and morph, and so I. So
Right.
how is using baptism in that kind of form, dealing with your kids as they're going to have this awakening? Could you use baptism as that? What would be another way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so Dante says beauty awakens the soul to act, right? Like
Mm,
that beauty, um, that beauty is something that comes at us from the outside, but it's something that is actually an opportunity to it we respond to it, right? We awaken to it, and now the question is just how are we going to act, right? The the response is almost impersonal, right? It's not a choice that we make. We see something beautiful. I remember we were riding on a plane um, from California to Spokane, or with Malachi when he was 18 months old, something like that. And we're loading everybody up, and we get everything, and then I looked down and said, "Where'd Malachi go?" And Aaron was like, "Where did Malachi go?" Right, we're on a plane; he can't get anywhere. And then I look up the aisle, and I see Malachi is sitting in the lap of a woman about 6 seats up, and I say, "Aaron, I think we found the most beautiful woman on the plane." Malachi had seen her when we were walking down. He had just stopped and immediately climbed into the lap of this 45-year-old gorgeous Latin woman, and she was just happy as could be. He was snuggling right in. he he saw a beauty as an opportunity to experience it, and just immediately hopped into her lap. And he was 18 months old, so he could get away with it. And Aaron thought it was really funny, and hasn't let him live it down. She reminds him of it every once in a while. Hey, this is how a beautiful woman's going to make you respond.
Right.
You gotta learn the right response, because there's in the same way that baptism is something that comes from outside of us, right? It's God, God putting his name on us from outside, right? We can't baptize ourselves. That's an important part of what Dante realizes. I could not have come up with Beatrice. That was not my idea. The beauty of a woman was something that was God's idea, and it's something that hits me from the outside, and that my job is to learn to respond to it according to God's definition, right? Who does God say Beatrice is? That is what ends up defining my response to her.
Now,
Who does God say that this young boy that I'm meeting, and who makes me feel fluttery, right? Who does God say he is? Who does God say I am? How do I live according to God, who the nature that God says I have? Right. And so that's going to involve learning patience, learning how are men and women supposed to interact? What does it look like? Paul's one of the worst things that we do is we say, tamp it down, tamp it down, tamp it down. Ignore it. It's not real. It's not the way, that none of that's real. Someday you'll understand what it actually takes to be married, and you don't have it yet. None of that is real. It's your body's trying to trick you. That's not it. That's a materialistic understanding.
Yeah, we've divorced the
understanding.
Yeah, we've divorced the spiritual and the natural. The body's actually telling you something, and it's having a real moment, and you're saying that's not real. You're disconnecting those two worlds.
Right. And Paul says, treat one another like brothers and sisters. Right. Young men, young women, when it's not time yet to get married, treat one another like brothers and sisters. There's actually something that there's a kind of relationship you're supposed to have while you wait. And that treating one another like brothers and sisters, that gets you into a relationship that's close enough that you can learn what's good and what's bad in boys.
Well, and that's what happened with Dante too, right? So you got Dante who becomes closer to this young lady and says he doesn't have virtue.
Right. And he was just talking with one of my sons who will remain nameless, and he was like, Dad, I'm not ready to get married. Right. Because he's 16.
Busted.
Busted. Yeah. Like, yeah, you're right. He's like, but I'm working on it. Right. Like, he he's got enough friends that are girls that he knows, yeah, I'm not in any sort of place to
Right.
take one of those home, but I want to be. And so I'm beginning to work on what kind of virtues do I need to grow in? What kind of habits and do I need to grow in? What kind of maturities do I not have yet? He's learning that by having friends that are girls that he's treating like sisters, by having real sisters that he interacts with, but also by, having sisters at school that are his age. And, we want to retreat from the temptation rather than say, than the temptations that come with it, because they might mess up, because most of us do, right?
Mm,
Right? We haven't dealt with our own shame, and so we treat we are fearful
yeah.
in the way we raise our kids. And so we say, retreat, 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 when God actually tells us, well, no, there's a way forward. Treat one another like brothers and sisters.
So okay, so I don't even know. You probably know how we got here, but we were supposed to be talking about Machiavelli, not liking Dante, and Machiavelli putting all the power in the government so that you could have the ability to transform and remake the world. And so he was fighting against Dante. I don't understand why Machiavelli don't like what Dante just said, because Machiavelli, I'm sure, was a man, so he understands the awakening of seeing
Right.
a woman. So what is it that
Well,
Machiavelli has against what we just got to understand about what Dante's talking about?
because Dante 100% says, I will give up all power I need to if this woman will let me stay close. Right. Machiavelli says, no, power needs to be gained, not given. Right. Right. So it's the relation. Part of it is a relationship with power. Now, Dante becomes one of the most influential people in history
Mm.
by giving up power and reflecting upon by saying, what do I need to do, right? I don't need power. I don't want power.
So but
He
when you say I want to, I
in
want to,
fact
I want,
he ends up um he does work in the government for a short period of time. He loves his city. He works in city government, and then he's exiled. And he he spends his life in exile meditating upon his love for the city, his love for this woman, his love for God. What does it look like? How and then what kinds of, the Divine Comedy, the first section where he walks through the Inferno, he learns he has meditated upon all of the ways that people talk themselves out of following God, right? And so the Inferno is this walk through hell, and each person explains why they'd rather be here than with Jesus, right? Each person he meets, and it's not really an actual, he doesn't think he's metaphysically walking through what hell is really like. It's people, but people are in hell because they don't want to be with God, right?
mm,
They're not in hell because the opportunity to be with God is there, and it's, but they would say, no thank you, I'd rather be in hell than be with Jesus. Let me explain why, right? And so it's really it's all the Inferno is almost a um apologetic text, a on the psychology of unbelief. Why is it that people would rather be in hell than be with Jesus when given the opportunity? And he's got all these people explaining themselves. Right? It's really, really helpful because we tell ourselves those sorts of lies, right? Still, anytime we're choosing sin, we're telling ourselves a lie about reality, about who Jesus is, about what he's called us to. We're agreeing with the hath God said of the serpent and choosing death rather than life. Walking through hell and hearing people explain themselves, telling you out loud the lies that they told themselves their whole life, is supposed to be good for our soul and help us to share the gospel better. The purgatorio is people that they really do love the Lord, but they continue to tell themselves lies
mm.
that keep them from obeying well, right? And so he's walking through what kinds of lies do we tell ourselves, that keep us from growing into who God created us to be. And then the paradiso is all of the truths that, if we knew and understood and embraced, then it would keep us from sin. It's really, it's it's poetry. It's pretty straightforward poetry, but it's also beautiful, thoughtful, right? That's what he spent his life doing, instead of trying to gain political power.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to hit on. Like, so when you talk about power, I just wanted to make sure that we define that he's not, in one sense or another, he's actually gaining power, but he's doing it the way in which God had designed it to be gained, because he's not trying to gain power in the sense that he's being God to call things that are not, you're now a man, even though you're a woman. You're not, yeah. Or the state having power. He's not working in that way. He's actually working in the way of a being who is functioning and calling things the way that God has called them. So like you said, working with the tools that God has given you and enjoying the pleasures of God and give you the way that he's told you to enjoy them, that is where the real power is, right? That's the transforming power, not the kind that Machiavelli is actually. He's going after a different kind of power, which is a God type of.
So he's gaining the power to be a flourishing human being. Right. Machiavelli wants the power that God has, and he won't call, and Machiavelli, Foucault, Karl Marx, they won't call it power unless they have God's power. As Plato has a similar definition of knowledge, where he won't call it knowledge unless it's the kind of knowledge that only God has. And and Dante is gaining the power through his life and poetic meditations, and to embrace his own humanity, enjoy his life. And Machiavelli, if you're trying to gain power, you need everybody upset, right? You need people that cannot handle the life as they have, so that you can promise them something different, right? You need, and this is one of the things that Karl Marx talks about with perpetual revolution. You've got to have people perpetually dissatisfied with what the government has given them, with what their economic system has given them, right? You need them envious of thinking that I need something else to be satisfied, so that you can promise that to them and start a revolution. Right? If you're going to overthrow the current power system and take it for yourself, you need people envious. Dante wants people flourishing, and he's trying to help them see how they can flourish with or without any power.
Jason, this is one of the power. So here's one of the things that I've been really upset about. I'm on Instagram, and every now and then, or even just prime television, when you're watching the commercials that'll come up. What I see on Instagram, I follow a group of people, and I think because I follow them, I get certain things in my feed. And one of the things I get is transgender folks, a lot of guys, for whatever reason, and they'll do their makeup stuff. Maybe it's because I follow artists who do makeup and that's probably why I get that. So, but they do makeup stuff. And when you see them, the way they look like what we recognize as a woman, right? In the makeup and in and you couldn't tell the difference just in the face that is actually a guy. And when I see that, it drives me nuts, because it's not that the guy is necessarily trying to look like a woman. I want to take it a little step or further than that. We've created this other type of woman that's made it easy for a guy to look like her. Right? We've devalued the beauty that comes from a woman in such a way that even a guy can put on some paint and look like a woman.
Right.
And so I guess I want to get to this idea that the battle for this awakening in men comes a lot of ways from the beauty of a woman. And so the more that we can mar the imago Dei in the being of women, the less that stirring, that real stirring that it's inside of the heart of a man doesn't awaken, because he gets some false sense of trigger because of a false sense of beauty, because the image is underneath all that and there's no real awakening.
Yeah, if you're flipping through pictures of beautiful women and it's possible that some of them are not women, it definitely undermines the um the thing that's supposed to that is a good thing from God, right?
Yeah.
And this is something that, you know, you've got something as messed up as it is, like, you know, old 007 movies where you're like, okay, I'm not saying this was good or good storytelling and any is great heroism, anything, but they understood like a beautiful woman has an effect on a man. Now, often it turned out to be that was being used by a Russian spy to undermine something, right?
Because they knew
Yeah. So they're trying also to separate the fruitfulness and the beauty, which is what Dante and Chaucer and we as Christians ought to be always pushing back together. The beauty and the fruitfulness need to be the end. The proper use of beauty is fruitfulness. But that what they understood was that reaction, right? You could get a reaction from a man. We're so far that you still can't even get that. You know, you get that's what you get on your feeds. I get basketball and erectile dysfunction ads.
Yeah.
And it's probably my age or whatever. I don't know why, but it drives me crazy because I'm like, I don't understand why. Like, I understand the basketball, right? Because I like watching basketball
Yeah.
clips, and so I get a lot of basketball clips. But then I get all these erectile dysfunction things. I think, well, but that is a huge, real problem. I mean, even when I was pastoring, I was surprised at how much of a problem that was. Wasn't the men coming to talk to me about it, but women would say, "Here's the problem I'm having in my marriage. My husband doesn't want to have sex anymore."
Wow.
I don't understand it. And when you talk to them, what you learn is that in California, you have this crazy culture where there's a lot of public pornography and public nudity, and the Christian men are trying so hard to learn to be faithful that they have to shut down their response to women, right? Their response to women to be able to just go out and do their job in the world,
Yeah.
right? And so it's not like, oh, you find out they've got a porn problem or something. It's the
They shut off their
opposite,
stimulus.
right? They've had to basically say, I can't respond. And so you think, okay, right, this is a problem we can pray and address, and God can sanctify a marriage through this, and often just getting it into the open, into a communal conversation with somebody that loves them and cares about them and tells them like, hey, you're like, you're not a weirdo. This is normal. You're not the only person I'm talking to about this.
Well, and that's because
let's pray together. Often that's all that it took. They would say like, really? I just didn't know. Like, it was just the shame kept it in the dark in the corner, and just pulling it out into the light and looking at it all together and saying, normal reaction to a hard situation. Let's pray together. It began healing. But we're so clamped up by shame that I mean, it would be the wrong thing to announce it to the whole church.
Right.
Hey, here's the problem that we've got. It's the right thing to go to your pastor, and pull it out into the light together and say, we don't know what to do. There's pain involved. There's healing that needs to happen.
But Jason, that's something that's actually the precursor to that is in the family, actually. So if parents are working with their
Mhm.
kids with
Yeah.
how to deal with these kind of things and how, I really, we can get kind of real here in a second. Um, thank God for my mom, saved me from all kinds of heartache and shame. So I was able to, be a virgin for marriage. The What no one told me though was that, you know, becoming one with a woman opens you up to a whole new world. Like you talk about, you become it's a new world. The whole world is new,
Right.
and you see creation differently. All of it, everything is
Right.
different. It is a whole, I mean, I remember the world's different the next day,
Yeah. You're like,
you know?
"Well, this place is in color."
That's exactly right. And I remember, we went downtown, Minneapolis, and I remember going down the escalator, and I remember it felt like I was in a fog. The whole world has just morphed for me.
Right.
And I'm looking around at human beings and I'm like, is everybody else going through this? How come, and so all of a sudden dealing with your passions and controlling them is almost like a drip. And then when you get married, all of a sudden a waterfall happens.
Yeah.
And when that waterfall hits you, it's like everything floods, and you don't have anybody to really talk to about that, or
Right.
no one told you that was going to happen. No one told you how beautiful marriage really is, and how you need to operate afterwards. Right? No one ever talks about that.
Right.
And they don't get into like, man, listen, you had perimeters and guards before. You're going to need those guards and perimeters now even harder, because your garden just expanded and exploded. And so
Right.
what you need to protect becomes way more important than what it was before, because you just had seeds in there. You have now stuff is sprouting up out the ground.
Right.
And so you have a lot more to protect and garden and field than you ever had before. And no one really talked about what that was, or how, or even like just how open you are and exposed and vulnerable you are. And so, and I guess I'm bringing that up to say, like, so to have parenting and parents work through those kind of things to understand and say, hey, so what you don't do is you don't shut off the valve. Right? That's not what you're supposed to do. God gave you a waterfall for a reason. He gave you this garden for a reason. He got this kids for a reason, right? You cultivate that. And you work with it, and you learn how to let the waterfall feed and water the garden and take care of the garden while you guard it. And you learn how to guard that territory that you have in your mind, in your home, everywhere around you. And, this is why Solomon, drink from the fountain of your own sister, right? They drink
Right.
from, love the woman of thy youth. He's understanding this. And if I didn't have that, if I wasn't reading the Bible and having those kind of anchors, I would have been like, what is going on here?
Yeah, it's what's so interesting. So Gnostic religions were almost always built around sex, right? In
Mm,
the ancient world, right? It's mystery religions, Gnostic religions, there was some sort of sexual component to it, or food. Sometimes it was built around strict diets, but which is,
we're so
I
there
think,
right now. Oh
we're
my
still there.
goodness.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh my goodness.
yeah. It's hard to not just laugh, because it's either you're gonna laugh or you cry. But it's because that experience of sexuality, especially when you're in a Gnostic infused culture where you're kind of ghosts bouncing along the surface and not really communing with creation the way we were intended to, because our sin has um, pulled our humanity out of itself and separated, shattered it. That experience of communing with with matter, with another creature, is so powerful that we begin building religions around it.
Mm.
Chaucer, Dante, that Christian medieval view says, hey, it's super awesome and it's really fun and it's enjoyable, but you can't start taking it seriously. Right? You can't start acting like it's giving you something that actually only God in Christ gives, right?
Mm.
You can't, and
Mm.
because what's going to happen is it's going to start shifting and changing, and you're going to think, I n- I need something's wrong. I need to start over. I need to find a new. I
Right.
need to find a new one.
Falling out of
Um,
love with you.
yeah, I'm falling out of love with you.
Yeah.
Um, and that's not to say it's not great and wonderful and powerful. It's just not a religious experience,
Yeah.
right? It's a different, but that there's other kinds of good things besides religious experiences, because God has created a world that's full of good things, right? That it's part of his overflowing generosity that he gives us something like sex.
Right.
And it but then he says it's not even really a it's not really a religious thing, right? It's part of the family. It's not a church thing, it's not a religious thing. It's like a fun thing that creates new people. Like, that's all really good. But as soon as you start taking it seriously, like it's bringing, right, it's a real experience of communion. It's a real experience of unity. Um, and not just with
Would you say? Would you?
not just with that one person. Like, it's an experience of unity with the generative spirit of the way God created the world, right? Like, new people pop into existence through our love, right?
Right.
That's a
Right.
real thing, and it's not a religious thing. It's a it's a it's a it's not a
When you say it's not a religious thing, you mean like it's not a sacrament,
it's not a sacrament, right?
right?
It's not bringing us any sort of special knowledge that, it's not, right? It's not changing our nature. That's one of the,
Interesting.
right, we don't have our nature is not malleable. It But because of the power of those moments and the good the gift that they are, we have a tendency to think that it's a nature, that it's shifting our nature
So matures our
somehow.
nature, right? So it does mature us to be
Yep,
more the
yep,
kind of things that we are,
right,
but it
exactly.
doesn't change the nature from one thing to a different thing.
When it's used properly, it's a communal experience that moves us
Well, let me ask you.
towards towards maturity. But
So,
that's a different sort of that's a different sort of thing than than I mean, our culture really does believe in a sort of Gnostic, um,
uh-huh. I get. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
that it changes who we are, that it can somehow make us into a different sort of creature, and so we have to keep going back for it.
So here's the deal, though. Wouldn't the perversion of that beauty, the perversion of that, it does have an effect in a way that um destroys the nature of, and you become beastly, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's one of the things that the perversion of sex, the perversion of that awakening used wrongly. I'm thinking Romans 1, where they are messed up so that
Right,
they don't
right.
their nature actually deforms. Is that fair to
Yeah,
say?
yeah, that they're acting against their nature, or their yeah, there's an unnatural use of sexuality, right? And we tend to think unnatural just means gross or something like that. Like, that's unnatural, like American Pie unnatural. Like,
Right,
this
right,
is,
right.
but it's actually, when he says unnatural, he's say it's against our nature. You're acting against the intended use of your body parts, of who you are. And that has a way of dematuring us, or moving us away
Away
from
from, yeah.
our own humanity, or shattering, deforming, bending our humanity against itself, so that we become, at war within ourselves, is another way that Paul talks about it, right? That we are actually fighting ourselves.
I think we're gonna have to do another one on this.
But the 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 thing that I do hope people walk away with is that, I, um, that when they don't that they look at their teenagers, and they learn how to say, "Hey, yeah, I get it. I remember what that was like. Because and there's a way to embrace the fact that you're starting to have crushes on people in a Christian way that draws you closer to Jesus. You don't have to run away scared. Um, and and so much of that just has to do with learning that Jesus already died for us. And so all the stupid things we did as teenagers have all been buried in the grave. And you don't have to be ashamed or worried about it, and you can tell your kids about it.
So here's a question then. I mean, we'll have to. I think we need to pick up Dante again because I feel like we just kind of got into Dante. Um,
we
so
we basically talked about why we need him, not so much about him.
yeah, I need to know more about Dante because I'm trying to figure out now with this. I came into this expecting to talk about being in conversation with Dante and not knowing it, but we're actually in conversation with Machiavelli and not knowing it. Like
Yeah,
everything right now, when you look at politics, when you look at I mean, everything is politics now, but you look at anybody who's trying to do anything, even the pro-life movement is all this Machiavellian type of push. Everything is that. And all of a sudden you start saying like, wait, that is not the way. The way is, again, we've talked about this on the show. We can have, and it's not that we don't engage and deal with politics.
right.
That's not what I'm saying. But the power in dealing with politics is found in the awakening that happens between a man and a woman
Right.
that create a family that sacrifices themselves for their kids and raise those kids in the fear and admonition of the Lord. And those kids go out, do the same thing, take them. And this process of sacrificial love from one person to the next is where the true power really is,
Right. Right.
and so, but I guess part of my question, and I'll let you finish up with this, cause I got to run too, but, who are we ever actually in conversation with right now? Are we actually in conversation with Dante?
No, I mean, I wish we were. I think, right now we are really sort of, I mean, we're in conversation with Machiavelli, Darwin, Freud, I think probably. So Freud
I got
was
to put
a
him on the list too.
psychology of, he was a psychologist of sexuality, and he was doing everything he could to basically rid us from Dante's understanding of sexuality.
Wow.
Um,
Wow, this is amazing. Why didn't we talk about this on the politics of sex? We should have really, like, this would have been a phenomenal conversation then when we had the conference, because it's funny that everything that we're talking about, everything we're engaging is all going back to Adam and Eve in the garden. We really have to get way more comfortable with our own mythos, right? Like we got to understand that so much better because
there's alternative mythos that's being pushed and assumed and really hard, and we're willing to play on that baseball field rather than say like, no, I'm not. I mean, abortion would be unthinkable if we didn't have the mythos that we assume right now.
So you have to, before we go, the next 5 minutes, we got to know what books you brought out that we never got to, because people going to get mad at us for
that. So personally, I use Dorothy Sayers' translation, but I think it's out of print right now. So I've every time I find it in a used bookstore, I snag it up, and I just found one for my daughter. And look, Sayers, it's a great translation, but mostly because the notes are really, really helpful.
Okay.
She explains. She's just brilliant. She explains everything as she goes. So
Dorothy Sayers' translation of what?
Dorothy Sayers' translation of the Divine Comedy.
Okay.
But Anthony Esolen is also, he's got a good translation. It's really readable. And then C.S. Lewis's Allegory of Love is a little bit harder to find, but it's really, I'm noticing a theme that how often I'm like, this book's out of print, but it's really a great book. The Allegory of Love by C.S. Lewis. I think it just came back into print in a paperback edition, though. He walks through the um, basically the pre-Machiavellian mind, um, to show, and sometimes you're like, oh, that thing about that was weird, right? So I'm glad that we don't believe that anymore. But a lot of times, as he walks through, this was the book that he was writing when he got saved, the Allegory of
Mm.
Love. So this basically shifted the studying the medieval understanding of love and community so shifted his imagination that scripture could finally be put into a context that made sense.
Mm.
So, um, and then th- this was the other one. Um, this is a book on writing, actually. It's on creating character arcs, but it's about the way. So she's writing this book about the way plots change, rescue, the way plots can change a character from believing a lie to believing the truth. But I was just rereading it for my screenwriting class, and realized how full of wisdom it is on these sorts of things, that um, how to identify the what the story that we're telling ourselves in the moment, um, is it's really a hard thing to do. Um, this is a book about how that works. And I've even rereading it now, find it really helpful in identifying my own internal dialogue. What story am I telling? What character am I casting
Mm.
myself in this moment? And how am I justifying that? That is often the lie that we're telling ourselves, that when we recognize it, we can say, okay, well, here's the lie I'm telling myself. Right now, I'm acting like I'm the hero in this moment
Would you
when I'm
text me the
act.
title for that book?
Yeah,
Because that's
yeah.
when we.
It's called Creating Character Arcs by K.M. Weiland. It's great, and it's like it's better than all of the self-help books that I've read on a internal dialogue or whatever. But it's
That's because
um
that's a huge. I gotta run, but this is one of the things that's so important is when we are living, we gotta figure out. You told me this too. Is we need to know when we're communicating to people what is a lie that they're telling themselves, and how do we get underneath that to really have a
yeah,
conversation with them.
yeah.
That's
How do
really
we get
helpful.
how do we back in behind the lies?
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and tell, because there's a story that's justifying that lie.
That's right.
How do we back in behind the lie and tell a true story? Because usually, if you just come against the lie directly, it's like, I'm just gonna I'm gonna shoot at the shield over and over.
So
And then
go
the
ahead.
last one is Charles Williams. I couldn't afford the real copy, so I've got the
The
Kindle
print.
copy. Um, and it's Charles Williams wrote a book, just called On Beatrice, and it's Dante's uh, understanding of romantic love as God communicating His own beauty to us. So it's really it's a little bit heady, because it's a more of a book about a poetic, kind of a poetic metaphysic, but it's really really worth the read. Charles Williams was a good friend of C.S. Lewis. He was a poet. He was an interesting poet. He's a very heady poet. Was never a very popular poet, but was a really great thinker. It's kind of a little bit of a weird guy, but that sometimes happens when you're.
I mean, you're that kind of heady, though. It makes
Yeah.
sense. We need weird guys.
Right. Right.
So next week, next Tuesday, we're trying to do one every week now. So I figured that the last two, they were 2 hours long, give people plenty of time to jump in.
Yeah.
Wait, so we've only missed 1 week so far. But what do you want to hit with Dante next week? Kind of all of the who Dante is, why he's
Yeah.
important.
Maybe we'll talk about who Dante is, and what would it look like to
Be in conversation with him.
be in conversation with him, to be able to jump in and read. Because I think now people will say, like, well, now I need to read him, but I don't know where to start. And
That's how I am.
yeah,
I
maybe
know I
we
need
can
to
do
read
it.
too.
Where to start. and then maybe set up whoever we're going to next after this.
All right, I got the list. And you know what? If you're listening and you're trying to figure out, man, I wish they would bring up first. Oh, a couple things real quick, and I really have to go. But Jason doesn't think anybody listens to this podcast at all. And so, like, you have to say something on Facebook or Twitter so he knows that somebody's out there listening. And the past couple of weeks, I've been getting a lot of messages from the last few that we've dropped. So tag Jason on Twitter and let him know, like, people actually are listening. And, if there's somebody who you think would be really good for us to go through, I have a list right here already. We got Marx, Aquinas, Chesterton, Lewis, Milton, Freud. We want to talk about platforming wisdom. That was one of our other ones too. We got Kant, Hegel, Chaucer, the Revolution Framework. We have that, and then who is this? Burke.
Oh yeah, we got to talk about Spanish.
Talking about Burke. So that's a lot of stuff to go through. But since we're gonna do one every week, we're gonna have to.
Yeah, we got
plenty of time to go through. So
obviously we're never in a hurry.
No, this is 2 hours. We just hit 2 hours in 1 minute. So if there's anybody that you guys think that would be really good to talk through and to talk about who you think we're in conversation with, I think we got pretty much everybody who's in the main conversations right now in public opinion. Hit us up, let us know so that we can talk about those guys, because Jason's got those guys somewhere around in his head, if not on his bookshelf, already to discuss. So